Okay, we'll resume, please, and Mr. Bray.
Thank you very much, sir. So the application was refused by the council on two grounds, which essentially relate to the impact of the proposal upon the continuing regeneration and improvement of the area as a result of its impact upon the attractiveness and self-confidence of the area, and the public perceptions as to risk posed by the proposals. At the time that the application was determined by the council, the development plan comprised the saved policies of the UDP and a regional strategy. Since the application was determined, the UDP, I suppose I should say, has been substantially replaced by the core strategy and the waste plan. It is therefore necessary to consider the proposals in the light of the policies which currently apply and relate the Council's reasons for refusal to those policies. Much time was taken up at the inquiry by the appellant in questioning whether the development plan was up to date at the time of the determination, and the absence of any reference to the draft core strategy or draft waste plan policies in the reasons for refusal. This was misconceived and a distraction from considering the real issues before the inquiry. The application was quite properly determined by the Council in accordance with the development plan at the time of the determination of the appeal. This was the appropriate basis upon which the Council were required to determine the application. The officer's report set out the relevant policies. No criticism was made of the officer's assessment of the policies or the manner in which they addressed those policies, nor could any such criticism be made. The report explains that the core strategy provided an up-to-date expression of the Council's strategic planning policy, and as such can be considered to be a material consideration, alongside the regional spatial strategy, the revised Trafford UDP, and other relevant planning documents. The principle of the development is considered at the beginning of the observations section of the report. The report specifically draws attention to UDP policy WD5 and makes it clear that the proposal must be assessed in accordance with this policy. Reference is made to policies within both the core strategy and the waste plan. There is no suggestion in the report that the policies within those draft plans conflict with the UDP policies or mark material departure in policy or approach. There is no suggestion that the relevant UDP policies are out of date in any form or should not be given full weight. Significantly, the report states that the waste plan carries some limited weight in respect of consideration of the proposal. And of course, Mr. Cunnington reminds us that was the appellant's position at the time as well. It's paragraph 218 of CD 15A. Indeed, the appellants in their planning statement were at pains to say how little weight the waste plan carried. This was the only comment on weight within the officer's report. Surprisingly, given his extensive evidence on the matter, this was the one paragraph to which Mr. Singleton failed to refer. Whilst no comment was made on the weight to be given to the core strategy, as the core strategy was no further advanced than the waste plan, there could be no logical reason for adopting any different approach to the core strategy. In the circumstances, the only conclusion to be drawn from the report is that the then extant development plan was the proper basis upon which to determine the application. And this was all ultimately accepted by Mr. Singleton in cross-examination. The statutory requirement when a local planning authority refuses planning permission is that the decision notice shall specify the policies and proposals in the development plan. The decision notice complies with this requirement. It is common ground that the appeal must now be considered against the relevant policies of the current development plan. There is agreement that these include the core strategy policy L6, and that this policy requires consideration to be given to the impact of the proposal on the regeneration of areas in need of regeneration. Mr. Singleton accepted that this effectively carries forward and is consistent with the policy in the UDP, policy WD5, which was referred to in the Council's first reason for refusal. It was therefore agreed that the concerns raised by the Council in the first reason for refusal continue to be supported by the development plan, and that the first reason for refusal now falls to be considered against this core strategy policy. It was also agreed by Mr Singleton, and previously recorded in the Statement of Common Ground, that in determining the appeal, other particularly relevant development plan policies are waste plan policies 10, 4, 5 and 8. And the Statement of Common Ground makes it clear that there's a disagreement between the policy as to whether the proposal complies with these core strategy and waste plan policies, and this is a matter to be considered at the inquiry. The forensic analysis of the wording of the reasons for refusal takes the matter no further and distracts from consideration of the merits of the appeal proposal. In addition to the changes at the local level, there has also been a significant policy change at the national level, with the replacement of most policy by the framework. Plainly, the proposal needs to be assessed against the framework. The inspector at the pre-inquiry meeting identified one of the main issues for the inquiry, identified from the Council's reasons for refusal, to be whether the proposal would be sustainable development as set out in the National Planning Policy Framework. The Council's statement of case confirmed that the Council would address how the application should be considered in relation to these new policies, and in particular in the context of whether the proposal constitutes sustainable development. The issue of the sustainability of the proposal is particularly important in relation to the balancing exercise and the weight to be given to the local perception of risks against any benefits of the proposal. The appellants have spent much time making the point that this is a renewable energy project, and Mr Singleton appeared to suggest that the proposal should be considered primarily against renewable energy policies. However, in cross-examination, he agreed that both renewable energy policies and waste policies required consideration, and that he did not suggest that there was any conflict between the renewable energy and the waste policies. And so said at the pre-inquiry meeting, the main issues for the inquiry arising from the Council's reasons for refusal were identified as the effect of the proposed development on air quality, the perception of the effect of the proposed development on human health, the effect of the proposed development on the continuing improvement and regeneration of the local area, and whether the proposal would be sustainable development as set out in the framework. These main issues are addressed in these closing submissions, albeit in a different order. In addition, the inspector requested submissions on other matters which have been dealt with in the evidence during the course of the inquiry. So said, turning first to whether the proposal would be sustainable development. The application is founded on the proposed plant burning mainly waste wood, diverted from landfill, avoiding imports and sourced locally. This is central to consideration of the sustainability of the proposal. Mr Singleton agreed in cross-examination that the source of the fuel for this proposal has implications for the sustainability of the proposal. The proposal has been promoted on the basis that it will be diverting waste wood from landfill. The principal purpose of combustion of waste through energy from waste is to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill. Only waste that cannot be reused or recycled with less environmental impact and would otherwise go to landfill should be used for energy recovery. Government policy only envisages and supports recovery of energy from the combustion of waste when in accordance with the waste hierarchy. This is seen, for example, in National Planning Statement EN3, paragraph 2.52 and 2.55, first and third bullet points. This is, of course, the NPS on renewable energy, and demonstrates that the presentation of the proposal as a renewable energy project doesn't alter the approach to be taken. Government policy is that the sustainability of the biomass fuel is a relevant and important consideration in deciding on any application for consent. It is for the applicant to provide an assessment to demonstrate that the proposal conforms with the waste hierarchy. Government policy is that the decision maker must be satisfied that the proposal accords with the waste hierarchy. Government support is only for sustainable biomass, doesn't support biomass which is not sustainable. The recovery of energy from waste is only supported when it is in accordance with the waste hierarchy. The application will have been considered by consultees on the basis on which it was presented, namely that it was diverting waste from landfill in accordance with the waste hierarchy. And the Inspector and Secretary of State will need to consider the latest information and evidence on whether the proposal will divert waste from landfill. There has been a significant change in the evidence with respect to waste wood to landfill since the application was determined, in the form of the latest information published by DEFRA. That's throughout here, can I just say I refer to core document 80. Mr. Cunnington's submissions remind me that that seems to be a document that's been repeated twice in the core document. So you've also got it as core document 94, which I think is how Mr. Cunnington has referred to it. How sustainable doing it twice was, we won't comment on, sir.
Okay. But it's the same document.
It's the same document. So the appellant was aware of this information and its importance was raised by Mr. Watson when discussions were held with respect to the drafting of the Statement of Common Ground. Surprisingly, despite the obvious relevance and importance of this material, the appellant refused to address it in the Statement of Common Ground. Mr. Singleton attempted to explain this position on the basis that the Statement of Common Ground was limited to addressing matters raised in the reasons for refusal. This would have been an unusual approach to take, and indeed all the more inappropriate, given one, the fact that the question of whether the proposal represented sustainable development had been identified by the inspector as a main issue for the inquiry, and two, the need for the appellant to address this matter and satisfy the Secretary of State in accordance with the national policy identified above. It was not in any event the approach that had been taken. There are numerous examples of issues addressed in the Statement of Common Ground which did not arise out of the reasons for refusal. There are, for example, extensive references to agreement on environmental and technical matters which had not been raised in the reasons for refusal, and there are extensive references to national policy on renewable energy and biomass. Mr. Singleton's explanation for the appellant's uncooperative approach was also contradicted by the suggestions put to him and accepted by him that the Statement of Common Ground had addressed the question of supply of waste wood. In passing, it can be observed that the passages in the Statement of Common Ground relied upon by Mr. Singleton and the appellant as an agreed position on supply are in fact no more than agreement as to what the various policy documents stated, and all of these documents predate DEFRA's latest assessment of the position. Although the appellant was not prepared to record it in the Statement of Common Ground, it is common ground that core document 80 sets out the latest up-to-date position with respect to the potential supply of waste wood going to landfill. This document reviews the latest data and concludes that approximately 0.6 million tonnes of waste wood is going to landfill in England. Although this is accepted to be the up-to-date position, and although Mr. Singleton referred to the document, both in his original proof and rebuttal, he failed to draw attention to this particularly pertinent statistic, despite extensively quoting other figures. This omission is repeated in the AEA report, which again quotes many other figures but fails to acknowledge this figure. There is again no satisfactory explanation provided for the failures to refer to this figure. Mr. Singleton agreed that government policy has been to divert waste from landfill by increasing landfill tax at a rate of £8 per year, and in accordance with the government's policy, this can be expected to have had an effect. One would have expected Mr. Singleton to agree that this must mean that older data on waste arising and disposal to landfill is therefore less robust. Surprisingly, whilst he accepted this for waste in general going to landfill, he claimed that he was not sure that the same conclusion would apply to waste wood. Mr. Singleton's response to Mr. Watson's evidence on this issue is the report from AEA. That report concludes that Mr. Watson has used the most recent data, but suggests that he had not given the full picture owing to omission of other relevant or recent publications including what it terms DEFRA 2012 and some newspaper articles. The nomenclature used by the AEA report is confusing. What it calls DEFRA 2012 is in fact a report prepared by AEA which had been published alongside CD80. This is particularly confusing as in other parts of the AEA report it refers to CD80 as DEFRA 2012, and it is not clear why it was felt necessary or appropriate to call an earlier AEA report DEFRA 2012. The earlier AEA report was concerned with a life cycle assessment and did not provide an inventory or any data on arisings. The only information it provided was taken from the earlier RAP 2009 report. It provides no further information and takes the matter no further. Furthermore, and importantly, the earlier AEA report was plainly taken into account by DEFRA and informed its views as expressed in CD80. Reference to the earlier AEA report, therefore, takes the matter no further and does not call into question the figures expressed by DEFRA. The main point that Mr. Singleton and AEA appear to wish to make is that there is uncertainty about the data. Again, this does not help. Core Document 80 acknowledges the uncertainty in introducing the figure of 0.6 million tonnes, but having acknowledged this uncertainty, states that their most recent analysis, see Figure 3, shows approximately 0.6 million tonnes of wood waste going to landfill. Furthermore, it is accepted that this inquiry must proceed on the basis of the latest and best information available. There is no basis for suggesting that this latest data is any less certain than earlier data, which was of course relied upon by the appellants without any acknowledgement of uncertainty. It is somewhat ironic that the appellants argue that one should simply rely on objective assessment in addressing the Council's second reason for refusal, but to appear to argue against relying on this approach in considering this matter. The newspaper articles relied upon by AEA and Mr. Singleton were produced in Mr. Singleton's rebuttal Appendix F. The articles do not help the appellant. They are all merely anecdotal reports with no assessment, analysis or data. The first report simply discusses the potential impact of possible changes to government policy with respect to subsidies. This is clearly a matter for the government in considering what subsidies it provides, and in undertaking this consideration, the government will doubtless give proper consideration to the implications of its proposals for dealing with waste wood. Indeed, one of the issues which will be considered is the impact on recycling wood of subsidies for biomass. Mr. Singleton was furthermore unable to say whether any changes in policy or subsidies might have implications for the appeal proposal. The second report was published prior to Core Document 80, and insofar as it was relevant, would have been taken into account in preparing Core Document 80. It is not in any event apparent that the relevance of this document, what the relevance of this document is to the supply of waste wood in general, or the supply in the Northwest in particular. Significantly, in the third report, the Environment Agency advised that they are unaware of any difficulties and suggest that any stockpile of waste wood is no more than the normal seasonal variation. That is, we would suggest, the end of any issue with respect to this report, but there are further points to note. Insofar as any issue is raised in this report, it is an issue for the south and east of England. There is no issue raised with respect to treatment or disposal of wood in this region. It is furthermore clear that what is being said is that any issues have arisen as a result of a mild winter, and this is a temporary issue which will be resolved by a cold winter and an upturn in the economy. Whilst mention is made of the closure of the Sonai plant, this is again a temporary issue. The important points to note with respect to Sonai are A, it's closed because of issues which do not go to supply, and B, it was recycling wood. The material going to Sonai is not material which would go to landfill, and it would be a wholly inappropriate response to divert this material lower down the waste hierarchy to energy recovery. AEA and Mr. Singleton suggest that weight should be given to the appellant's views and those of others in the area. However, these documents likewise do not assist, for reasons accepted by Mr. Singleton in cross-examination. The Peel statement does not identify any report that is available to them or any additional material which has not been addressed by Mr. Watson. The Peel statement does not provide any information as to volumes or sources of waste arisings. Very significantly, the Peel statement makes no mention of diverting waste from landfill, but it does contemplate importation of waste. There is absolutely nothing in the report to assist in evaluating whether the proposal would comply with the waste hierarchy. The statement from Hadfield Wood Recyclers makes a repeated reference to using a recycled wood as a source of supply rather than lower grade wood diverted from landfill. The author of the letter is plainly aware of the distinction between recycling and recovery, as can be seen from the final paragraph. And in any event, given the business in which he is involved, he would be expected to know the difference. Far from assisting the appellant, the statement confirms that the proposal would not be using wood waste diverted from landfill. In short, there is nothing in the further material identified by AEA which casts any doubt upon core document 80 or Mr. Watson's evidence on this issue. Whilst AEA refer to other reports in Table 4 of their report, these all predate core document 80, and it is agreed that they were taken into account by DEFRA in coming to the views expressed in core document 80. Indeed, comparison of the reports shows that there has been a decline in waste wood which accords with policy. Whilst AEA and Mr. Singleton failed directly to address the issue, it is plain that they accept that Mr. Watson's figures are the appropriate figures to use for this inquiry and provide no alternative figures that should be used. If the appellant or AEA had wished to, they could have undertaken an assessment of waste wood arisings and the amount going to landfill in the country or the northwest, but for whatever reason they have failed to do so. The northwest is responsible for about 12% of UK waste arisings, and it's appropriate to conclude that this applies to waste wood arisings. If core document 80 is correct with respect to the amount of waste wood going to landfill, there is plainly insufficient waste wood going to landfill in the northwest to provide for the proposal. 12% of 0.6 million tonnes is 72,000 tonnes, whereas the appeal proposal requires approximately 140,000 tonnes of waste wood. One comes to the same conclusion if one looks at the figures relied upon by the appellant. The 2009 RAP report indicated that there were 542,900 tonnes of waste wood arising per annum in the region in 2007. This will have fallen since then, so one can use this figure for comparison. On average, 83% of wood waste is reused or recycled, with the remainder increasingly used in biomass power stations and for co-firing. This leaves a total, at most, of 92,000 tonnes for energy recovery in landfill, which is again inadequate to provide for the appeal proposal. It can further be observed that this is not materially different from the 72,000 tonnes calculated in core document 80. When properly analysed, the figures relied upon by the appellant are not that different from those contained in core document 80. It must furthermore be remembered that the appellant already has the benefit of a consent for another biomass plant on Ince Marshes, which would require 176,000 tonnes of waste wood per annum, and there are a significant number of additional operating and proposed schemes. The appeal should be determined on the basis of the latest information and data. However, even if one were to apply a degree of caution to the figures, there is still no support for the appeal proposal. Given the presence of the other operating and consented schemes, it is abundantly clear that even if core document 80 has underestimated the amount of waste wood going to landfill by a significant margin, there would still be an inadequate supply for the appeal proposal. The proposal is promoted on the basis that it will be diverting waste wood from landfill, and the source of the fuel for this proposal is acknowledged to have implications for the sustainability of the proposal. One is left with the clear conclusion that the appellant has not demonstrated, in the light of the more recent evidence, that there would be a supply of wood diverted from landfill which could provide for the needs of this proposal. Core Strategy Policy L6.2b requires all developers of new waste management facilities to demonstrate the proposal's consistency with the principles of the waste hierarchy. Similarly, Waste Policy or Waste Plan Policy 4 requires the development to accord with the waste hierarchy. In the circumstances, the appeal has not been shown to be sustainable development in accordance with the framework and national and local policy. This has important implications for the planning balance and public perception. There is a further issue which gives rise to concern with respect to the sustainability of the proposal. The proposal has the potential to provide CHP. However, policy requires that in such a case, CHP should be provided. For example, Policy 8 of the Waste Plan provides that applications for waste management facilities that have the potential to utilise biogas or energy from waste-fired technologies will be required to provide compliant heat and power unless it can be demonstrated that this would prevent the development of waste management facilities that have the potential to deliver important waste infrastructure. This policy was considered by the appellant in the Environmental Statement Supplementary Statement. It was recognised that the policy requires applications which have the potential to utilise energy from waste to provide compliant heat and power unless it can be demonstrated that this would prevent the development of waste management facilities that have the potential to deliver important waste infrastructure. Mr. Singleton, who was responsible for the production of this statement, agreed that this was the correct interpretation of the policy, and that the policy should be interpreted in this manner despite his evidence to the contrary. At that stage, i.e. the stage of the supplementary statement, it was argued that it was not necessary to comply with the policy on the basis that the proposal's primary function was an energy plant, and therefore it did not have to demonstrate compliance with the policy. This argument is no longer maintained. The statement went on to consider the proposal against the policy and stated that it was the appellant's aspiration to capture the heat, and it had commissioned a study, but that this was not yet complete. However, it observed that initial feedback from the study concluded that supplying potential receptors would require significant investment, and a return on this investment would be dependent upon the delivery and support of the renewable heat incentive, over which there was uncertainty. The study has not been provided. The reason given for this failure is commercial sensitivity, which is not a convincing explanation. It is not clear why a report could not have been provided which did not disclose confidential material. However, it is clear from the statement that any CHP would be expensive and dependent upon subsidy. No information was provided on the availability of such subsidy. In the circumstances, Mr. Singleton had to agree that the appellant had not demonstrated that CHP would be provided. Furthermore, he agreed that reliance was not placed upon demonstrating that requiring CHP would prevent delivery of important waste infrastructure. Mr. Watson, who has significant experience in CHP, explained how CHP was not in practice provided if it was not planned at the outset. The unsatisfactory position with respect to CHP is a further issue which calls into question the sustainability of this proposal. So I turn then to impact on regeneration. The appeal site is located to the north of the Davyhulme wastewater treatment works, which is the only strategic heavy industrial use within the Urmston area, and is bounded by the Manchester Ship Canal to the north-east and south-west, and the Barton High-Level Bridge, which forms part of the M60 to the east, with the Trafford rectangle beyond. The access extends underneath the Barton Bridge into Trafford Park. The facilities at the wastewater treatment works have expanded due to an increasing population and improved technologies. Over time, residential development has been developed closer to the boundary of the site. Whilst the two uses are not ideally compatible, they now exist side by side in what is effectively a suburban environment to the south of the M60. The wastewater treatment works has been a source of complaint, and the odours associated with it and the memory of them has had an adverse effect upon the attractiveness of the area and the wider perception of the area. Regeneration and improvement works at the wastewater treatment works have significantly improved the environment in the vicinity of the works, including the formation of the nature reserve and measures to improve the water quality of the Ship Canal. The works have resulted in significant reduction in odours and complaints about odours in the area. However, the stigma associated with the wastewater treatment works will take longer to ameliorate. The appeal site is essentially located on the edge of a residential suburb in a pocket of industrial activity. The residential neighbourhoods of Davyhulme, Brixton and Urmston are located to the southwest, south and southeast of the wastewater treatment works. The closest residential properties are less than 550 metres from the appeal site, and Urmston Town Centre and Woodsend Circle are approximately 1.3 miles or 2 kilometres from the appeal site. Schlar sites are located around the wider Urmston area, and the AQMA, the Air Quality Management Area, covers part of the appeal site. The location of this additional activity close to residential properties increases the perception of risk for residents, impacting on their quality of life. Mr. Singleton contested this description of the character of the area. He suggested that the appeal site is located in an area characterised by a range of large regional scale non-residential uses. However, this characterisation is directly at odds with the core strategy, which Mr. Singleton had relied heavily upon, and which he said was founded on an extensive and up-to-date evidence base. The core strategy contains spatial profiles of the various areas within the borough, and Mr. Singleton told you that he took no issue with and agreed with the analysis in the spatial profiles. The spatial profile for Urmston explains what area is covered by the profile. It says the area is bounded by the M60, the Manchester Ship Canal and the Mersey Valley. It is plain from the description that the part of the appeal site to the west of the M60, which Mr. Singleton emphasised was the main part of the appeal site and the real area to consider, falls within this area considered as Urmston and addressed within this spatial profile. Mr. Singleton sought to rely upon Figure 1 in the core strategy to argue that the appeal site fell within an unprofiled area between Urmston and Trafford Park. There were a number of very obvious flaws with this argument. Figure 1 is a diagrammatic figure. It is not a plan which is intended to provide any precise boundaries or even to be accepted to any form of accurate base, or related, I should say, or even to be related to any form of accurate base, such as an OS map, as Mr. Singleton accepted. Secondly, the figure plainly cannot be used to contradict the clear description in the spatial profile. Given the clear description, which refers to the area being bounded by very clear identifiable physical features, there can be no question of a diagrammatic figure undermining or casting doubt upon the definition in the spatial profile. Thirdly, Mr. Singleton was, in any event, inconsistent in his approach, as he contended that the figure actually was not diagrammatic in the case of Trafford Park, and and consequently one could conclude that Trafford Park extended right to the eastern boundary of the motorway. Not only was it inconsistent to argue that the figure was diagrammatic, but then contend that in some cases it was not, but it made no sense that the spatial profile area to the east of the motorway should extend to the very motorway boundary, but not on the west. And fourth, the effect of Mr. Singleton's approach would be that substantial areas are not within any spatial profile area, given the spaces between the different areas identified in Figure 1. Mr. Singleton also contended that the wastewater treatment works was not within the Urmston spatial profile area. This was a very surprising suggestion, as the description in the spatial profile is again very clear. It observes that Urmston, the area under consideration, is home to two strategic facilities: the Davyhulme wastewater treatment works, containing the Millennium Nature Reserve, and Trafford General Hospital. Despite having this pointed out to him, Mr. Singleton appeared to maintain that the wastewater treatment works did not come within this area. This is so plainly wrong that it is difficult to understand how Mr. Singleton could continue to maintain this claim. But the fact that he did merely served to undermine his judgment and interpretation of policy. Mr. Singleton and the appellant also sought to argue that it had been agreed that the appeal site did not sit within Urmston by reference to paragraph 8.23 of the Statement of Common Ground, which provided, whilst the appeal site is not explicitly located in any specific spatial profile area, it sits in between the defined areas of Trafford Park and Urmston, and this is repeated in Miss Harding's evidence. This does not assist Mr. Singleton for a number of reasons. First, the statement is merely recording that the site is not expressly referred to in the spatial profiles, and in fact straddles across two spatial profile areas, with the eastern part in Trafford Park and the western part in Urmston. Second, Mr. Singleton himself argued that the statement needed interpretation, as he argued that the eastern part of the site did sit within Trafford Park, given his conclusion that Trafford Park extended to the motorway. But despite this, he continued to claim that the western part of the appeal site did not sit within any spatial profile area. It is impossible to see how that interpretation can sensibly be made of this statement. In any event, whilst the statement clearly only means the site straddles the two identified areas, if it did mean something else, that would not in truth alter the correct interpretation of the core strategy. One does not need any assistance in interpreting the core strategy on this point, as the description of what is included within Urmston in the spatial profile is clear. One might wonder why Mr. Singleton spent so much time arguing a plainly unarguable and wrong point. The answer is obvious. The spatial profile expressly contradicts his assessment of the area. It states that the Urmston area is made up of a number of distinct residential neighbourhoods, including Flixton, Davyhulme, Woods End and Urmston itself. It is predominantly a residential area. Mr. Singleton agreed that this assessment had been made in full knowledge of the wastewater treatment works, given the reference to it later in the assessment. There is no basis for disagreeing with or ignoring the core strategy spatial profile. In the light of this clear assessment in the core strategy, Mr. Singleton has plainly proceeded in his evidence on a fundamentally mistaken basis with respect to the character and nature of the area. That part of the appeal site to the west of the motorway, which includes the building and the stack, is plainly within a predominantly residential area. This fundamental error undermines his assessment of the impact of the proposal, and in particular, his analysis of the reasons for refusal. Mr. Singleton agreed that the Council has been proactive in promoting regeneration in Urmston and Woods End Circle. the council purchased the shopping centre, Eden Square, in Elmston in 1999 in order to promote its regeneration and redevelopment. The regeneration of Elmston Town Centre was supported by the UDP, where it was identified as a regeneration area, whilst regeneration in Woodsend was also supported in the UDP. The council has taken active steps to secure regeneration, but that which has been achieved has not been without its difficulties. There were problems with the residential development in Phase 1 of Eden Square, despite the benefit of the presence of Sainsbury's underpinning the scheme, and there are still a substantial number of unlet retail units, 7 in Phase 1 and 3 in Phase 2. Whilst development has been slower generally over recent years, the form that has held up well has been more conventional supermarket development, and the scheme has provided a conventional large Sainsbury's store, together with Aldi and Iceland. Given the efforts to date in difficult conditions, it was important that nothing be done to prejudice the ultimate success of this development. The Victoria Parade in the town centre is plainly in need of regeneration. There is no evidence that this is due to the redevelopment of Eden Square, although Mr Singleton considers this may be part, at least, of the reason. Whatever the reason for the condition of Victoria Parade, there is clearly a need for the council to take steps to regenerate it, and there may be a need for the council to reassess its role in the town centre. Whatever the reason for its condition, it is important for the health of the town centre that Victoria Parade is addressed. The council is actively promoting the regeneration of Woodsend Circle, and it's again important for the area that it should succeed. The fact that Elmston Town Centre and Woodsend Circle are no longer identified as priority areas for regeneration in the development plan does not mean that regeneration is no longer a material consideration, or that it is no longer important. The fact that they are no longer identified as regeneration priority areas is a reflection of the council's actions in regenerating these areas, but it does not remove the importance of making the best use of the steps already taken. The impact of the proposal on regeneration of areas such as Elmston Town Centre and Woodsend Circle is a material consideration in the determination of the appeal. The general issue of the impact of this type of proposal on regeneration in the wider area has been recognised as a material consideration in a number of the appeal decisions identified by Mr Singleton. Mr Singleton produced a report from Mr Hetherington to support the appellant's case. In considering this report, it is important to bear in mind that he did not attend the inquiry and was not subject to any cross-examination. Very surprisingly for a surveyor, his report provides no details of his background, his source of knowledge, or his expertise in the area about which he reports. His signature does reveal that he is a member of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, but surprisingly for somebody associated with this body, he doesn't provide the normal declaration provided by surveyors. These omissions are all the more significant when one notes from the report that Mr Hetherington is not locally based. Indeed, he is based in Lancaster, some 50 or 60 miles away, in a completely different market area. He does not say anything to suggest that he has any relevant local knowledge. He does not even say that he works in the relevant fields about which he gives evidence. Whilst his firm is described as chartered surveyors and property consultants, there are many different types of surveyors dealing in many different fields. The assumption cannot be made that he has any particular expertise in the fields about which he gives evidence. There is no explanation provided in either Mr Hetherington's report or by Mr Singleton as to why somebody from the local area with local knowledge was not instructed as one would normally expect. Given the absence of any evidence to demonstrate that he has any local knowledge and his failure to attend for cross-examination, no weight can be given to this report in support of the appellant's case. However, analysis of the report reveals that it fails to establish the propositions it proposes. Mr Singleton agreed that the report sets out to demonstrate whether the proposal had a negative effect on regeneration of the area. in fact interjecting, the report suggests that it sets out to demonstrate that the proposal has not had a negative effect on regeneration of the surrounding area, as is apparent from the second paragraph on the second page, which states, if it can be demonstrated that the proposal has not had a negative effect on the regeneration of the surrounding area since being publicised. Mr. Singleton's refusal to accept this was surprising. Second, Mr. Singleton agreed that the report set out to demonstrate that the vitality and self-confidence of the area remains stable. The report, third, is prepared on the basis that if the first two propositions can be established, then it can be argued that the proposal would have little impact on future regeneration. Mr. Singleton agreed that in order to determine whether conditions remain stable, it is necessary to undertake a comparison of the position prior to the event under consideration with the position after the relevant event has occurred. Similarly, to demonstrate that there has been no negative impact or effect on regeneration, it is necessary to undertake a comparative assessment of the position before and after the relevant event under consideration. No such necessary comparative assessment has been undertaken by Mr. Hetherington, and he gives no evidence of any such comparative assessment, again agreed by Mr. Singleton. Given that Mr. Singleton accepted that in order to be able to argue that there would be little impact on future regeneration, it was necessary to undertake the comparative assessments, and that no such comparative assessments have been undertaken, the only logical and possible conclusion must be that even if all of Mr. Hetherington's evidence were to be accepted, it would not establish that there would be little impact on future regeneration. Surprisingly, Mr. Singleton refused to accept the logic of his own and Mr. Hetherington's reasoning. Mr. Singleton did eventually accept that if it were necessary to undertake the comparative assessment, it would mean that Mr. Hetherington could not demonstrate that there would be little impact in the future. Given that Mr. Hetherington has stated that this was necessary, and that Mr. Singleton accepted that this was necessary, the only conclusion must be that Mr. Singleton did accept that Mr. Hetherington could not demonstrate that there would be little impact in the future, but he was just not prepared to say so explicitly. Mr. Singleton also accepted, first, that Mr. Hetherington's assessment proceeded on the basis that if there is no negative impact in advance of the grant of planning permission, there will be no negative impact if the development were to proceed. Second, there is no evidence to establish this proposition, it is just a judgment, that is, an assumption. Third, the proposition is not self-evidently correct. Fourth, prior to the grant of planning permission, there can be no certainty that the development will be able to proceed, and there can be no certainty that planning permission would be granted. Indeed, the Council's position and that of the local community is clear: the development should not be allowed to proceed and will be resisted. And fifth, even if the development were granted planning permission, there is no certainty that it will proceed. The logical conclusion of those concessions must be that the position is materially different prior to grant of planning permission, or even prior to commencement of development, and that people's perceptions and the market effects will accordingly be different. This is borne out by the evidence of local people who have made the point that if permission were to be granted, they would move away. Again, Mr. Singleton resisted the logic of his own answers and said that he did not know what the position would be or how the market would react, although he did say that the outcome would be uncertain. Even on this basis, it would be clear that Mr. Hetherington's reliance on events prior to grant of planning permission as demonstrating what would happen after grant of permission was flawed. In any event, analysis of Mr. Hetherington's evidence reveals that he is unable to provide any useful or meaningful data evidence. The Council's first reason for refusal is based on impact on Davyhulme, Flixton and Elmston. but Mr. Hetherington chose to look at impact over a wider area. This involved looking at areas where the council had not suggested there would be any impact. If one looks at a wider area, one will inevitably dilute the impact. At the bottom of his second page, that's Mr. Hetherington's second page, he asserts that the formal planning application did not negatively affect regeneration activity. Mr. Singleton agreed that he does not state how or why he comes to that conclusion. There is no analysis to support or explain the conclusion, and there are no comparisons. Mr. Hetherington then addresses various developments. The following points were accepted by Mr. Singleton with respect to this analysis. Firstly, with respect to Eden Square, Phase 1 was granted planning permission as long ago as 2006. It included the Sainsbury's store, which is a form of development which has bucked the trend and proceeded despite the recession. But the development has not been easy. 10 units remain unlet. Phase 2 received consent in 2010, but again required a redesign. Pre-lets were necessary in order to enable the development to proceed, and we are not informed when the pre-lets were achieved and whether this predated the appeal proposal. Then, with respect to Trafford Quays, this is a proposal by another part of the appellant. The application was made in October 2010, but has not been determined. The delay in determining the application is as a result of a Section 106 obligation not being provided. The delay in obtaining the obligation is notable and raises questions about the proposal, and it doesn't tell us anything about general market interest. Then, with respect to Barton Cross, Mr. Hetherington didn't tell us about his source of knowledge on this issue, and Mr. Singleton had no knowledge about the development. If a surveyor were to provide evidence as to values, he would be expected to have personal knowledge of transactions and be able to provide details. In fact, Mr. Hetherington does not give any details of prices actually achieved. All he refers to are asking prices advertised, which tells us nothing about actual values. There is no indication as to what, if any, incentives were offered in order to secure sales. With the exception of Hayes Green, Cadishead, which are below, there is no comparison with any other site. There is no information to explain the sales rate or how Mr. Hetherington knows about them. There is no comparison with the position before the appeal proposal. It's not possible to see the impact of the biomass proposal. The residential development of this site was a long-standing proposal. It was originally granted planning permission in May 2007, and it took 4 years to get moving. It is not, or was not, possible to determine when Persimmon were committed to developing the site, and whether they'd effectively gone past the point of no return prior to the appeal proposal, and or had to make the best of a bad job once the appeal proposal came along. Turning to Hayes Green, Cadishead. This is the only site which is compared to Barton Cross. It is in a very different locality. It's in Salford, on the other side of the Manchester Ship Canal, some distance from the conurbation. There is no evidence to suggest that Cadishead is at all comparable as a locality with the locale of Barton's Cross. If a comparison is to be undertaken, it's important that the localities are properly comparable, given the old adage, location, location, location. The development is on the site of a former chemical works, which had been heavily contaminated, and this was likely to affect people's perceptions of the development and hence sales rates and prices. The site is located between an industrial park to the northeast and more industrial development to the southwest. There is no evidence that sales rates or prices could be expected to be similar to Barton Cross. There's no information with respect to financial and other reasons behind the development of the site. The fundamental point of location is simply not addressed. And so, just if I interject, I would observe that given all of the above, the failure of Mr. Hetherington to give any indication as to his knowledge of the area and his base some 60 miles away becomes particularly significant. There is no evidence upon which any meaningful comparison can be made between the two sites or any meaningful conclusions drawn. So turning back to Mr. Singleton's answers, with respect to Calder Court, this is part of a much larger and wider series of proposals to deliver 198 affordable homes in Sale, Old Trafford and Davyhulme. It involves a redevelopment of a previously developed site, replacing 30 existing bungalows with 33 dwellings. This would appear to be a replacement of public housing with new public housing. It is a public sector social housing scheme. There is a clear pressing need for affordable housing in the area, and it doesn't tell us anything about the general market. Then with respect to the Nag's Head pub, this is sheltered housing. There's again a clear need for this form of development. There's been no decision on the application to date, and accordingly the proposal is not advanced. With respect to Vauxhall Road Depot, the application predates the appeal proposal and again involves a social housing proposal. Arndale Properties, the site is not within the area the council has said causes concern, as set out in the reasons for refusal. The application was made at effectively the same time as the appeal proposal, but it has not proceeded and it does not tell us anything about the market. Then with respect to City West Eccles, again, this is not within the council's area of concern. The scheme involves regenerating former local authority flats. It is publicly funded. It was all planned prior to the appeal proposal. The flats are in need of renovation, and something would plainly have to be done to them, irrespective of the effects of the appeal proposal. Turning to Eccles New Road, again, this is not within the council's area of concern. Again, it's public authority housing. It was completed shortly after the application was made for this proposal, which means it must have been started and committed long before the appeal proposal was known about, and again, it tells us nothing about the market or the effects of the appeal proposal. Turning to Salford Red Stadium. This was a long-standing scheme. Development of a stadium on this site was originally considered at a call-in inquiry in 2006. There was a pressing need for the rugby club to relocate, given that its previous stadium was wholly inadequate, and that the club was in danger of being thrown out of the league if it did not provide better facilities. Both the club and the local authority were anxious that the club remain in Salford. The development involved substantial amounts of retail development, which was contrary to policy but justified as enabling development. In order to justify the development, the club had demonstrated that there was nowhere else it could go. And then turning to Cadishead Leisure Centre. This is again a long way from the council's area of concern. It involves publicly funded development and it tells us nothing about the market. So, sir, the appellant has not provided any evidence which suggests, still less establishes, that development in the area of concern has not been affected by the appeal proposal. With respect to Barton Cross, it is clear that this is a long-standing scheme and that Mr. Hetherington has no real details about what has happened, particularly with respect to sales. Indeed, there is no examination of whether the developers have pursued a strategy of ensuring that the development is disposed of in advance of any determination of the appeal. There is no proper comparison of what has happened with Barton Cross or any other development in the area, or development prior to notice of the appeal proposal. Most of the development that Mr. Hetherington refers to, I'm sorry, I read that badly. There's no proper comparison of what has happened with Barton Cross or other developments in the area with development elsewhere or development prior to notice of the appeal proposal. Most of the development that Mr. Hetherington refers to has particular reasons for being where it is. Most of it is public sector or publicly financed or supported development, and much of it is not even in the area of concern to the council. As Mrs. Harding explained, there has been limited work done nationally on the economic impacts of incinerators, but the most appropriate study to consider is the 2003 New Haven study, the economic impact of an EFW incinerator in New Haven, by the Centre for Economics and Business Research. This study identified that an EFW incinerator could potentially impact on New Haven's attractiveness as a place to live, to work and to do business. The New Haven study was informed by two significant studies, the first being from the United States of America, which evaluated in detail the impact of an energy from waste incinerator, the Keel and McLean study. And the second being published by DEFRA into the disamenity effects from landfill sites as measured by UK house prices, DEFRA 2003, a study to estimate the disamenity costs of landfill in Great Britain. The Keel and McLean study established the sensitivity of house prices to a number of different factors, including the distance from the energy from waste facility, and investigated how house prices changed over time before any information was publicly available through the construction period, early operations and mature operations. One can note it undertook the type of comparative assessment which was singularly lacking in Mr. Hetherington's report. Systematic changes in the size or elaborateness of houses sold over the period were taken into account, and the study included a detailed description of each property's location, including the distance from the incinerator, the distance from the central business district, the distance from the main highway junction, and whether the property had a lakeside location. Regional trends in property prices were taken into account by indexing house prices to average house price changes in the Boston area. The rigour of the study again contrasts with Mr. Hetherington's superficial approach. The Keel and McLean study found that the evidence suggests that the incinerator is a negative externality for North Andover overall. The ongoing effect was found to have an impact on house prices of $6,607 per mile, against an average house price at the time of $242,242. The effect was evident up to a distance of 3.5 miles. The study found evidence that house prices close to the incinerator dropped relative to prices elsewhere on rumour of the new site, fell further when construction began, fell further still when operations began, and recovered slightly after 4 years of operation, but they were still significantly lower than they would otherwise have been. The DEFRA 2003 study examined the impact of landfill sites on property prices at different distances from the facility for houses across Greater Britain, based on detailed data on house prices over time supplied by the Nationwide Building Society, and included a detailed evaluation of the contribution of a comprehensive set of property and locational characteristics. The study found a significant correlation between house prices and distance from landfill sites. The study concluded that landfills had a statistically significant negative impact on house prices, and that it affected houses up to 1 kilometre away. Importantly, only 60% of the landfill sites considered by the study were operational, which suggests that a larger impact may have been observed for those that still accepted waste. The New Haven study also included original research into the impact of incinerators on house prices, which showed a steady increase in house prices as distance from UK EFW incinerator facilities increased, and research into the impact of EFW incinerators on the attractiveness of areas as a place to work or to do business, which suggested that incinerators discouraged image-conscious sectors. The New Haven study suggests that there is a negative relationship between EFW incinerators and the attractiveness of the surrounding area for investment in housing and business. There are good grounds for concluding that the appeal proposal would reduce the attractiveness of the surrounding area as a place to live and invest. There are good grounds for concern that this would have a detrimental impact on investment in the area, which would lead to much needed housing not coming forward in the local area. There are a number of SCHLAR sites in the area, and if these sites fail to come forward, that will have serious implications for housing in the locality, and the important economic stimulus which this development provides will be lost. It is furthermore essential that Urmston Town Centre continues to be an attractive retail destination. Much has been invested in the town centre, but its regeneration is incomplete. It is particularly important that nothing should undermine confidence in the area, and that full use should be made of the opportunity presented by the investment in the town centre. The significant levels of objection to the proposals demonstrate the concerns of the community in terms of perceived risk and its impact upon the attractiveness of the area as a place to live and invest. which in turn impact upon regeneration of the area. The communities have real fears about the impact of the proposals upon the area, and the studies considered above demonstrate that the fears are justified. Mr. Singleton argued that the New Haven report was not accepted by the inspector of the East Sussex and Brighton and Hove Waste Local Plan, and accordingly no weight should be given to it at this inquiry. Examination of the inspector's report reveals that the position is more complicated than Mr. Singleton suggests. After considering the New Haven study and all the other evidence, the local plan inspector concluded that the proposal as proposed to be modified by him would not have an adverse effect on either social deprivation or regeneration prospects in the town. It is important to understand what the inspector was referring to by the proposal as modified and the reasons for the modification. This is explained in paragraph 22.40 as Mr. Singleton agreed. The inspector concluded that whether an incinerator was acceptable or not would depend on a detailed study of an actual proposal in the light of the standards and controls applying at the time. I do not consider that the option should be ruled out as a matter of principle at this stage. However, because of this uncertainty, I also conclude that sites should not be allocated in the plan specifically for incinerators. Clearly, the inspector was concluding that acceptability would depend upon the precise details of a proposal. He was not therefore concluding that an incinerator would definitely be either acceptable or unacceptable. Rather, he was concluding that options should remain open at that stage, because the ultimate answer would depend upon careful consideration of detailed proposals. In the circumstances, the inspector was not finding that an incinerator would not have an impact upon social deprivation or regeneration, but rather that it would depend upon detailed consideration of the actual circumstances. The inspector's comments on the New Haven study must be read with this overall conclusion in mind. In addition, there are reasons to exercise care with respect to his conclusion, given his reasoning with respect to the study. He distinguished the North Andover study on the grounds that it was a 1980s incinerator where there had been problems from emissions, and such an incinerator would not obtain planning permission or a permit nowadays. This accepts that the North Andover study had properly concluded the incinerator had had a negative impact upon house prices, but seeks to suggest the same would not apply to a modern, well-run incinerator. There are two obvious flaws with this reasoning. First, the North Andover study established that there had been a negative impact when it became known that the incinerator was to be developed, with a further negative impact when construction got underway. This all predates any problems with emissions and makes it clear that the very presence of an incinerator caused these impacts rather than anything to do with problems encountered in the operation of the incinerator. Second, the fact that modern incinerators are better run has not allayed public concern. In fact, whilst the operating standards of incinerators has improved, the public now demands higher standards, and merely operating to better standards than in the past does not satisfy public demands or allay public concerns. It is these fears and concerns which feed through into investor confidence and hence investment and regeneration in an area. The higher standards demanded by the public were recognised in a recent RTPI article which stated that many communities faced with EFW proposals remain unconvinced. Despite stringent environmental and land use controls, perceptions of old-style municipal incinerators pumping toxic vapours into the air linger on. The scale of modern EFW plans, the transport of waste materials, and other amenity impacts trigger public alarm. it is important to remember that investment relies upon confidence. If public confidence is lost, irrespective of the objective evidence, this has significant implications for investment and regeneration. When the East Sussex Waste Plan Inspector's report is properly considered and assessed, it can be seen that it does not provide grounds for disregarding or giving reduced weight to the New Haven study. Mr. Singleton relied upon a number of other decisions to support the proposition that there will be no harmful impact on regeneration. However, as he accepted, each decision turns on its own facts and the evidence before the inquiry. This is a point which was expressly made by the inspector of the Battlefield Enterprise Park inquiry, who concluded that much depends upon particular local circumstances and context in terms of relationship with neighbouring areas and their particular effects on property prices and investment decisions. Mr. Singleton agreed with this analysis and concluded that any decision depended upon the local circumstances, the relationship with neighbouring users, and the evidence before the decision maker. This was also clearly the case in the Cornwall decision, which was also heavily relied upon by the appellant. When this decision is considered, it is clear that it was heavily influenced by the context of the proposal, and in particular, the fact that the proposal was sited in an area which was already severely impacted by tips and clay workings. Mr. Singleton agreed that in none of the appeal decisions he relied upon had the Inspector or Secretary of State concluded that this form of facility cannot have an impact on regeneration, and that whether it has such an impact is dependent upon the circumstances of the case. At times, the appellant appeared to suggest that consideration of house prices is not relevant. This misses the point. Whilst the planning system does not operate to protect house prices as such, Mr. Singleton acknowledged that house prices may be a signal of the relative health of an area. He agreed that house prices are affected by perceptions as to how attractive an area is in which to live. He agreed that they give an indication of how much people are prepared to invest in an area. He agreed that they are monitored by businesses and inform their views as to the economic health of an area, and in carrying out their investment decisions. House prices are therefore an important indicator of impacts upon the economic health and regeneration of an area. It was very clear from the evidence given by local people that the proposal is affecting the perception of the attractiveness of the area. Mr. Singleton accepted this and agreed that it was affecting people's willingness to stay and invest in the area. This accords with the evidence given by Mrs. Harding and the studies to which she referred. The proposal would essentially be a strategic heavy industrial process with potentially hazardous emissions and processes in a predominantly residential area. The scale of operation would impact upon perception and investor confidence in this area. This type of operation would not normally be encouraged close to residential areas or other sensitive receptors. This is the wrong location for this proposal. The physical presence of the proposal and the processes associated with it would adversely affect the area, and in particular, the perception of the area and confidence in the area as a place to invest. The area has suffered in the past from problems arising from the wastewater treatment works. These problems have been addressed as a result of significant investment, but the perception and stigma associated with this problem remains. Urmston Town Centre and Woods End Circle were identified for regeneration in the former UDP. The Council has been proactive in bringing forward regeneration in the area, but the position remains fragile. It is very important that this regeneration is not undermined. The proposal is adversely affecting investment confidence, and if it were to be allowed, the situation would be much worse. The Council was correct to conclude that the proposal would have a detrimental impact upon the vitality and attractiveness of Davyhulme, Brixton and Elmston, and would prejudice the continuing regeneration and improvement of the area. This was contrary to policy WD5 of the UDP and is now contrary to policy L6 in core strategy. So turning then to impact on air quality and perception of the effects on public health. I deal with both of those topics together because obviously they're related. So it's common ground that perception of risk to health is a material consideration. The issue between the parties is the weight to be given to the consideration. The appellant refers to a number of decision letters with respect to this issue, but does not adduce any additional evidence to address the issue. The appellant has also placed heavy reliance upon the plant being a modern, well-regulated facility, but it is agreed that this does not of itself answer the perception issue, and does not in itself allay public fears and perception. Just as with the issue of impact on regeneration, the appeal decisions are agreed to turn on the particular circumstances of and evidence in the particular cases. The proper approach with respect to this issue is summarised in Mr. Watson's proof, and this was not challenged. Human factors can, and sometimes should, be taken into account in making planning decisions. Health concerns are material considerations and should be considered by the decision maker. Decision makers must recognise that public concern is so important that it can, albeit in rare cases, constitute a valid reason for refusing planning permission, even if unfounded. Emotional responses to a proposed land use are capable of being material. Decision makers must attach due weight to the justified concerns of any companies that are concerned that if the proposal goes ahead, they may be forced to relocate. And perceptions of risk arising from the fear of repetitions of incidents following a previous history of events can be justified, even if the level of incidents has reduced. The position is clearly set out in the Newport Borough Council case. Public fears, even if they are not objectively justified or soundly based on scientific or logical fact, are a relevant material consideration. They are part of the human factor to take into account and give an effect as an exceptional or special circumstance. Depending upon the circumstances of the case and the evidence before them, inspectors have given significant weight to the perception of risk on occasions where justified by local circumstances. In this case, there is very clear and substantial evidence of public concern. There were more than 1,500, almost 1,600 letters and 4,744 signatures on petitions objecting to the proposal prior to the opening of the inquiry. In addition to the Council, the neighbouring planning authority, which would also be affected, Salford City Council, has objected to the proposal. There has been widespread objection from elected members and MPs. A wide range of objections were raised by the public, the majority of which related to concerns about air pollution, health and sustainability. The public concerns have resulted in the organisation of the Breathe Clean Air Group, who have submitted extensive material outlining the public's concerns. In contrast, there has been very little public support for the proposal. The majority of those supporting the proposal do not appear to have any real links with the local area and will not be affected by the proposal. It's not entirely clear why all of the supporters have written, although there does appear to have been a public relations campaign eliciting support for the proposal. The number of representations and concerns included in them are unprecedented in the experience of the Council. In the 10 years prior to the application, the two most controversial planning applications, one of which involved the other stadium in this area, the Lancashire Cricket Club, attracted 708 letters of objection and 263 letters and 3 petitions comprising a total of 1,003 signatures respectively. The refusal on grounds of public perception in this case, therefore, is rare and arises out of exceptional or special circumstances in accordance with the approach outlined in Newport. In order to give weight to the public's concerns, it's not necessary to establish that they are well-founded or scientifically supported. Care must be taken not to preclude proper consideration of this issue as a material consideration. The whole point is that public concerns need to be considered even though the concerns have not been made out. In this case, however, there is substantial evidence to support the public's concerns and demonstrate that they are well-founded and are not irrational. A substantial part of the appeal site falls within an AQMA. The appeal site is immediately upwind of the largest area of AQMA designation in Greater Manchester. The AQMA is particularly sensitive to development which may have an impact on local air quality. The appeal site is accordingly partially sited within an area particularly sensitive to development which may have an impact on local air quality, and the remainder of the site is immediately upwind of such an area. The site is upwind of Barton, which is a particularly deprived area. The residents of Barton suffer disproportionately from ill health, and it has a particularly poor life expectancy compared to England, the North West, and Salford. The proportion of its population who perceive their health as not good is nearly 50% higher than the national average. It was clear from Mr. Otham's re-examination that particularly deprived parts of Barton fall within the AQMA and the area affected by this proposal. The health status of the Trafford wards surrounding the appeal site are either poor or at average levels in Trafford. All of this was accepted by Mr. Otham in cross-examination, and he further agreed that these areas are particularly vulnerable to deterioration in air quality and contain people who are least able to cope with any such deterioration. The EU Air Quality Directive sets an objective of 40 micrograms per cubic metre annual average for nitrogen dioxide, which was legally required to be met by the 1st of January 2010. It is agreed that there are locations in the AQMA where that is not being met, and accordingly the UK is in breach of the directive and therefore European law with respect to the AQMA. This was also the position of the Environment Agency. The EA's own advice was that there are no grounds for assuming background annual mean nitrogen dioxide levels are below the relevant environmental standards. The appellant originally accepted that there were a number of locations with the AQMA where levels well in excess of the standard should be considered to apply, including at Tyndall Street. In cross-examination, Mr. Otham attempted to reduce the number of locations where this was the case. It can be noted that this occurred after he conceded that the earlier analysis of impact in these locations had relied on use of the chemistry module, which had been rejected by the Environment Agency. The reason for changing position was not convincing. In particular, reliance was placed upon the readings at the Salford Eccles station, but Mr. Otham had been aware of these readings when he had previously accepted that the levels were higher elsewhere. There are a number of reasons why the readings at Salford Eccles could be expected to be lower, including 1, the traffic flows on the M602, which is the relevant motorway near Salford Eccles, of only about half the flows on the relevant section of the M60. 2, Salford Eccles is upwind of the motorway and accordingly will be less affected by the traffic. In contrast, significant affected areas of the AQMA are downwind of the motorway. 3, the relevant part of the M602 is in Cutting, which will further reduce the impact upon the Salford Eccles monitoring station. In contrast, the relevant section of the M60 is elevated. The appellant relies heavily upon the DEFRA submission to the EU with respect to the applications for derogations from the directive, which was of course subsequently withdrawn. It is said that this shows that the exceedance in 2015 will be in limited areas. It is notable that Mr. Otham did not adduce any evidence as to what he thought the position would be. He merely drew drew attention to the DEFRA submission. Both Dr. Holman and Mr. Watson explained that in reality any reduction in nitrogen dioxide had been very limited over the last 10 years and had consistently failed to accord with expectations and predictions. This was particularly the case with respect to nitrogen dioxide associated with vehicle emissions, which is the main source of nitrogen dioxide with respect to this AQMA. They both explained that for there to be any prospect of meeting the directive by 2015, there would have to be a step change in emission reductions, and that they did not consider there was any possibility of this step change being achieved by 2015. They were firmly of the view that there was no prospect of the objective being met by 2015. Mr. Othen and the appellant did not expressly address the points made by Mr. Watson and Dr. Holman, but instead argued that it would be necessary to find that DEFRA were wrong in order to find in favour of Mr. Watson and Dr. Holman. The cross-examination of Mr. Othen revealed that there was no substance in the appellant's case, and that in reality Mr. Othen agreed with Mr. Watson and Dr. Holman on this issue, even though he was not prepared to say so expressly. Mr. Othen agreed that to achieve the required reduction in the background nitrogen dioxide levels would require a step change of the order stated by Mr. Watson and Dr. Holman. He agreed that he was unable to identify anything which might achieve this step change by 2015. He agreed that the DEFRA study to support the submission had been undertaken some time ago, he thought probably 2008 or 9. He agreed that the study used national rather than local data. He agreed that the study did not take into account new or consented development. He agreed that since the preparation of the study, important data had changed, including the fleet composition projections, which have changed as recently as the 7th of August 2012, and the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory. He agreed the road traffic emissions factors have changed since the original modelling was carried out. He agreed that these are important changes, but no modelling has been undertaken to consider their implications. And he agreed that the DEFRA study and modelling which supported it was not up to date. It is clear, on the basis of Mr. Othen's own evidence, that the DEFRA study and modelling is not up to date, and there have been significant changes since it was undertaken. Achieving the directive objective by 2015 would require a step change in emission reductions, and there is no realistic prospect of this occurring. The correct basis upon which to proceed the inquiry is, as Mr. Watson stated, that the objective is not likely to be met in this area before 2020. Nitrogen dioxide is harmful to health, and research has shown that it has not been possible to establish a safe level for nitrogen dioxide. A review of the research has suggested adopting an annual mean of only 20 micrograms per cubic metre, which is half of the current objective. It is important to keep this in mind when considering the points made by the appellant about compliance with standards. The setting of standards is driven by wider calculations than simply safe levels. It is agreed that it is clear that people within the AQMA, including those in poor health, are subject to levels of nitrogen dioxide in excess of the current EU directive, and that this proposal will add to those levels. Mr. Othen agreed that as a result of the proposal, an area that already suffers disproportionately from ill health will be subjected to a deterioration in air quality, although he qualified this by saying the deterioration would be negligible. This deterioration would come after a long history of the area being subjected to unacceptable levels of air pollution. The evidence shows that there is growing public concern about air quality, locally, nationally, and internationally. There is a clear and sound basis for people to be concerned that air quality should be improved, and Mr. Oaten agreed that scientists are currently having to look at this issue. The concern is enhanced by current and past failures to meet legal limits. Mr. Oaten agreed that there was a clear and sound basis for concern that the current standards should be achieved as soon as possible. Although the planning system operates on the basis of an assumption that the pollution control system will operate effectively and efficiently, Mr. Oaten recognised that this would not of itself remove public concerns and perceptions of risk. He agreed that there were aspects of the Environment Agency's consideration of this matter which would increase public concerns about these issues. For example, the Environment Agency had concluded that it was inappropriate to use the chemistry model in modelling the oxidation of NOx to NO2, and that they didn't consider that this was sufficiently robust. However, in addressing the issue of cumulative impacts, the Environment Agency then relied on calculations and modelling using the chemistry model. There is no explanation given for this approach, and no logical basis given the EA's stated position in taking this approach, which can only be considered an error. The Environment Agency failed to note that the modelling had used an inappropriate input for the Monin-Obukhov method. But when this was pointed out to them, they agreed that the input used in the model was wrong, but concluded it would not make a material difference without any form of assessment. The public's concerns with respect to efficacy and reliability of the pollution control regime is agreed to feed into public anxieties on this issue. Furthermore, it is agreed that these anxieties themselves have health impacts. The World Health Organization definition of health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This holistic definition means that health effects may arise either from exposure to harmful emissions or by anxiety caused by the perception that such exposure would be harmful. This is important because even if the perception is unfounded, there could still be a health impact within this WHO definition, and Newport needs to be considered in this light. Mr. Watson explained how factors associated with the processes in this case impact upon perception of risks. DEFRA has indicated the characteristics of a development which increase the perceived and acceptability of associated risks, and these are unfamiliarity, control, proximity in time, proximity in space, scale, and dread factor. And the Department of Health produced a similar list in the 1997 guide communicating about risks to health pointers to good practice, which showed that risks are generally more worrying and less acceptable if perceived to be involuntary, inequitably distributed, inescapable, to arise from an unfamiliar or novel source, to result from man-made rather than natural sources, to cause hidden and irreversible damage, to pose some particular danger to small children or pregnant women, or more generally to future generations, to threaten a form of death or illness or injury, arousing particular dread, to be poorly understood by science, to be subject to contradictory statements from responsible sources, and to damage identifiable rather than anonymous victims. The appeal proposals and the risks associated with them plainly have the various characteristics just identified. The appellant relies upon statements from Professor Bridges, but he plainly accepts the assessments outlined above. He does not contest the advice from either DEFRA or the Department of Health. Indeed, he refers to similar factors. Professor Bridges essentially makes 2 points. First, whilst it is impossible to establish that there is no impact, the evidence does not identify a significant impact. And second, it is imperative to focus on the objective assessment of the situation. This is, of course, the argument that has previously been advanced in the past in support of many pollutants which are now universally acknowledged to be unacceptable, such as the tobacco and asbestos industries. The approach, moreover, fails to address or even understand the point in issue, and is contradicted by Professor Bridges' own statement. Professor Bridges states that concerns about risk and perception of risk may not correlate to actual levels of health risk. This means such concerns and perception may not correlate to objective assessments of risk based on research. In turn, this must mean that such objective assessments cannot tell us what the level of public anxiety will be. As anxiety impacts on health, this must also mean that such assessments will not be able to predict the impact of a proposal on health. Objective assessments will not therefore be able to predict or inform the health effects and outcomes of a proposal. As such, objective assessments cannot establish levels of anxiety and therefore health outcomes. Simply focusing on such assessments, as Professor Bridges advocates, would result in deciding an application on an incomplete basis, which fails even to consider the full health impact of a proposal. All of this was accepted by Mr. Oaten in cross-examination. The internal inconsistency in Professor Bridges' report is linked to his failure to appreciate or acknowledge that anxiety arises precisely because such objective assessments are not trusted. The past record of such assurances on matters such as tobacco and asbestos, and past failings with respect to control of incineration, all feed into this anxiety. Given that public perception and anxiety is a material planning consideration, it is no answer to argue that this consideration should be given little, if any, weight because of objective assessments of risk. This is really an argument to ignore this very material consideration. When considering arguments raised with respect to objective assessments, it is also important to keep in mind that a major problem in this area is that it is very difficult to conduct epidemiological studies because of the complexity of factors affecting human health, as again demonstrated in the case of tobacco and asbestos. In considering this matter generally, it is relevant to have regard to the views expressed by the Health Protection Agency. The HPA's general position is that it is not possible to rule out adverse health effects from modern well-regulated municipal waste incinerators with complete certainty. But any potential damage to the health of those living close by is likely to be very small, if detectable. They consequently advise, since effects are likely to be very small, studies of public health around such incinerators are not recommended. It can be seen that the HPA do not say that there will be no health impacts. Rather, they say there could be health impacts, but they are likely to be very small. This clearly does not assuage public anxiety. Indeed, in the light of this statement, it cannot be said that there is no rational basis for public anxiety. Furthermore, although the HPA advised that they did not recommend further studies, they have now commissioned further research on the link between emissions and health outcomes. This research has been commissioned because the HPA recognise that there are public concerns about this issue. Mr. Oaten agreed that the HPA action was in response to public concern. This not only provides important evidence of public concern, but also indicates that the HPA considers A, that it cannot be dismissed as unfounded, and B, it is of sufficient weight and importance to merit the cost of further research. Reliance is also placed upon the assurances provided in the 2007 Waste Strategy, but this is in turn dependent upon the DEFRA 2004 report, which was based upon 23 studies. There are very clear limitations with respect to this evidence, as Mr. Watson explained. It can be seen at the general level there is a sound basis for the public's concerns. There are furthermore factors specific to this proposal which provide strong reasons why in this case considerable weight should be given to the public's concerns. I've already mentioned concerns held by the public with respect to the assessment of the proposal. There are further significant areas of concern particular to this proposal. In this case, the proposal involves an abnormally low stack. Mr. Oathen is unaware of any similar biomass plant operating with a stack height of less than 45 metres, or a stack that is only 2 metres higher than the building. The stack height has been fixed by the constraints imposed by the airport. In the absence of those constraints, a higher stack would have been provided. One would or could have expected something comparable to the stack at the proposed biomass facility at Incinerator, and Mr. Oathen said it would probably have been slightly shorter. At Incinerator, the stack height is 85 metres, and this was fixed with respect to reducing the ground level concentrations of nitrogen dioxide. Mr. Oathen explained that in Incinerator there had been a particular concern with respect to the impact upon the special area conservation. This is not an impressive argument. Whilst proper regard should plainly be had to the interests of the stack, there are no grounds for suggesting that the interests of birds within the sack are of more importance than the health of vulnerable people within an AQMA, where there is an extant failure to comply with EU law. This is merely another factor which feeds into public perception and anxiety. The stack height and arrangement relative to the building is agreed to be a non-standard arrangement and will not have been the type of arrangement anticipated in modern facilities. Mr. Oathen agreed that it would not have been envisaged when the authorities made statements about the health effects of modern well-run incinerators. He agreed that this was another matter which introduced a degree of uncertainty and that it would impact upon health concerns and public anxiety. The proposal relies upon achieving an emission standard of 125 milligrams per cubic metre of nitrogen. This is a further example of non-standard plant operation which will add to public perception of health risks. No boiler manufacturer has been able to identify any plant operating at that level of emissions. No boiler manufacturer has warranted that it would provide plant which could or would operate to those emissions. Mr. Oathen relies upon the replies from boiler manufacturers on this issue. When one turns to the details provided, ANDRITs provide no operational data. They merely say that they trust it would be achievable in principle, which offers no certainty. It is clear from their letter that their view depends upon a very precise fuel input, and that the proposal would not involve fuel that meets that specification, namely waste wood with a particular nitrogen content as a single fuel. Mr. Oathen agreed that the proposal did not accord with the ANDRIT's assessment. B&W stated that they felt confident that it would not be a problem, but if that were the case, it begs the question why this level is not being required elsewhere if it is so easily achieved. In considering this issue, it's important to note that Western Bioenergy Plant at Talbot is not managing to operate to these levels, despite burning virgin wood, which is associated with lower nitrogen emissions. And indeed, the nitrogen emissions have steadily risen as waste wood was introduced to the plant. The need to operate to these abnormally low levels adds another level of uncertainty and feeds into public perception and anxiety. The assessment did not take into account traffic emissions, even though there would be traffic emissions associated with the proposal, which would add to the predicted levels. This means that the assessment was not a conservative assessment as one could have expected. Mr. Oathen now seeks to put a figure of 0.776% on the additional impact of traffic emissions, but this assessment has itself adopted optimistic assumptions and unrealistically assumed that traffic would be running at a steady speed without stopping. A further area where the modelling had been unrealistically low was the use of the incorrect Monin-Oberkopf length. This area is now accepted by Mr. Oathen. He agrees that the Monin-Oberkopf length is important because of the urban heat island effect, which has important implications for the ability of the emissions to disperse or alternatively to be grounded in greater concentrations. He agreed that this could easily have been remodelled and revealed for the first time in cross-examination that it had been remodelled. The unverified result, he said, was to add another 0.05 milligrams at Tyndall Street, micrograms at Tyndall Street, which would increase the process contribution from 0.69 micrograms to 0.74 micrograms. This is a further matter which raises public anxieties and perception of a harmful health impact. Mr. Watson pointed out that the proposal is sited in an area which already is a hotspot for nitrogen dioxide emissions, and that the effect of this proposal would be to release at least 104.5 tonnes of NOx each year. And that, of course, is using the lowest figure. It could be considerably higher. This would increase the NOx emissions from the local grid kilometre square by some 178%. Mr. Oathen initially contested the relevance of these particular statistics, arguing that we should concentrate on the impact rather than the volumes. However, in cross-examination, he accepted the accuracy of the points set out above. Furthermore, this approach was considered important by the Inspector and the Secretary of State in the Blue Energy Appeal. As Mr. Watson explained, this must be seen in the context of substantial additional releases in a hotspot and within and upwind of extensive AQMA, which was not complying with the requirements of EU law with respect to nitrogen dioxide emissions. This all adds substantially to public perception and concerns. The Blue NG appeal has very clear comparables with the appeal proposal. Both involve substantial additions to an area of poor air quality impacting upon people with poor existing health. The appellant's attempts to distinguish the decision are misconceived, given that this is the important area of comparison. It is furthermore important to recall that the HPA, in advising on this scheme, did not address the impact of additional air pollution with respect to nitrogen dioxide on the AQMA, nor did they undertake a health assessment with respect to this issue. The HPA response addresses point emissions to air in section 5. Mr. Oathen agreed that the first two paragraphs of this section merely summarise what was done and said by the appellant. The third paragraph then states, with the exception of nitrogen dioxide emissions, which are considered separately below, which means, as Mr. Oathen again accepted, that this paragraph did not address nitrogen dioxide emissions. These are considered separately in the fourth paragraph, and this paragraph observes that despite emissions of nitrogen dioxide levels being extremely low, they will inevitably add to the existing high levels. Data indicates that background levels are particularly high and above the AQS objective in the northern part of the AQMA. The responsibility for assessing such impacts rests with the local authority, and so we do not intend to comment further on this specific issue. The HPA then undertook a human health risk assessment with respect to identified issues in section 6 of the response, but these did not include an assessment with respect to nitrogen dioxide. It is clear that the HPA did not assess the impact of the additional nitrogen dioxide emissions and made it very clear in their response that they had left this matter to the local authority. The response from the HPA cannot therefore provide any answer to the public perception of risk or anxiety in this case, and must in any event be viewed in the context of its general position that it cannot rule out health impacts. The local authority has made it clear from the outset that it does not consider this to be a good location for this form of proposal, given the existing poor air quality, the presence of sensitive receptors, and the constraints imposed by the site. The evidence established that there are areas within the AQMA which exceed, in some cases substantially, the EU directive of 40 micrograms. The proposal would result in additions of over 0.7 micrograms. That is a significant addition in the context of this locality, and the public perception and anxiety is rationally formed. In the particular circumstances of this case, considerable weight can be given to the public perception of risk. Paragraph 124 of the National Policy Framework provides that planning policies should sustain compliance with and contribute towards EU limit values or national objectives for pollutants, taking into account the presence of air quality management areas and the cumulative impact of air quality from individual sites in local areas. Planning decisions should ensure that any new development in air quality management areas is consistent with the local air quality action plan. The proposal fails to comply with this guidance and is a further respect in which it fails to satisfy the petitioner. It fails to satisfy the framework and fails to represent sustainable development as set out in the framework. The proposal has resulted in unprecedented public concern. There is a substantial objective basis for this concern. The proposal will add nitrogen dioxide to an existing area of poor air quality. There are furthermore important constraints and uncertainties associated with the proposal. The proposal is constrained by the close proximity to Barton Airport, which means that the stack height is half that of the comparable plant proposed in Ince. No similarly sized plant has such a low stack height. Furthermore, there is no similar commercial facility anywhere in the world operating to a similar emission standard. Given the existing poor air quality in the AQMA, it's a particular concern that the proposal involves non-standard plant and emission standards. In the absence of a directly comparable operating plant, it's particularly important that one should have confidence in the work that has been produced in support of the proposal. However, Mr. Watson demonstrates that there are a number of uncertainties attached to this evidence. Given this combination of factors, and the increasing body of respectable scientific evidence and opinion addressing the health impacts of air pollution, there is a sound and objective basis for the concerns of local residents. The appellant recognises that public perception of risk is a material consideration. The issue they raise is the weight to attach to this consideration. In the light of the evidence, significant weight can be attached to perception in this case, sufficient to outweigh the general support provided proposals of this nature. So, Sarah, the proposal would provide additional renewable energy. The Council supports the provision of renewable energy and acknowledges the need for additional renewable energy and the general support for such development in policy. It acknowledges that significant weight is to be given to the wider environmental, community and economic benefits of renewable energy proposals. However, it remains necessary to consider the impacts of the proposal and to balance any harmful impacts against the benefits of the proposal. The proposal would not represent sustainable development as set out in the framework. It would have a detrimental impact on air quality in an area of poor air quality. The area contains vulnerable people least able to cope with the deterioration in air quality. The evidence clearly establishes that in this case, considerable weight should be given to the perception of the effect of the proposed development on human health. The proposal would also have a seriously detrimental impact on the continuing improvement and regeneration of the local area. These harmful impacts outweigh the benefits associated with the proposal. In the circumstances, sir, the Council would invite you to recommend that this appeal should be dismissed.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. I didn't ask you not to respond in that way, Anyway, thank you, Mr. Fraser. It's now 10 to 1, so I think we will break for lunch. Will quarter to 2 be okay if you come back at that time? Yeah, okay. Back of course at 2, please.